Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, everyone. My name is Jordan Alt. I'm co-chair of Husch Blackwell's nonprofit organizations and religious institutions team. I'm glad you could join us today. I had the idea to host a webinar about things that kept nonprofit leaders up at night, and judging by the RSVPs, most of you aren't getting much sleep, so we will try to change that today. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. We'll do our best to answer them during the webinar, or we can reach out by email afterwards. If you'd like a PDF of the presentation, it's available in the program materials folder. The program has been approved for legal education hours. So for live attendees, report your hours by clicking on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. Tomorrow you should get an email with a certificate of attendance, as well as a recording of the webcast for watching or sharing. At the end of the webinar, you'll also get a short survey. We use that feedback, so please take time to complete it. Actually, the idea for our next webinar came from the survey completed at our last webinar. So we try our best to listen and to respond. So that's it for the housekeeping items. Let's get started with the program. The plan today is for each of our presenters to spend a few minutes offering some guidance, suggestions, and red flags based on their experience of what to do right when things go wrong. Nonprofits kind of in times of chaos or crisis or trouble. That should take about half of the hour. And then we'll discuss some hypothetical scenarios, just kind of conversationally, as well as tackle any tricky situations that you can submit by the question box. I am really thrilled to be joined by two great professionals today, Reverend Kim Jenny and Scott Schneider. Kim is a great pastor, client, and friend. She is the Director of Connectional Ministries for the Missouri Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, where she works with a great team in the areas of conferencing, communication, boundaries education, sexual ethics, and leadership development. Prior to ministry, Kim worked in advertising, focused on brand management and promotion for some bedrock St. Louis companies, including beer, baby food, and St. Louis Blues hockey. Kim is also one of those rare pastors that kind of hits the trifecta. She excels at preaching, pastoral care, and she truly understands the business and administration of how to operate a church. I'm so glad she's here to offer some guidance today. And Scott Schneider is a partner in our Austin, Texas office. He advises companies and educational institutions nationwide on a variety of complex issues with a focus on particularly sensitive matters like institutional response to sexual misconduct. He's a prominent litigator as well and a sought-after advisor on Title IX, labor and employment law issues, and various risk management concerns. I will tell you, if you have a news alert in place for Husch Blackwell, half of the updates you get come from Scott's work, which has got to be both exciting and exhausting. And he's just back from a recent trip running with the Bulls in Spain, which I just learned about. So all kinds of excitement today. I am Jordan Alt, like I said. I'm a litigator in Jefferson City. And in addition, I've become more and more an outside general counsel for a number of nonprofits, churches, and charities, kind of known as the church guy around the firm, and get called when there are issues of ecclesiastical law, First Amendment issues, things like that. So that's who we are. And now we will kick it off. And so I will kick it back to Kim to talk about crisis communication priorities.
Thank you, Jordan. That was a lovely introduction, and I'm going to spend my time talking about communication when things go wrong, and just some guidelines. These aren't the end-all be-all of communication guidelines. I'm sure there's great ideas that your teams will have too about how to approach kind of a crisis or a disaster situation. But these are some guidelines that I try to keep in mind as my organization goes through difficult times, and hopefully they'll be helpful to you. And the first is, this is my practice. You probably hear me talk about this a lot. Try to be responsive versus reactive. It is really critical to preparing for difficult times if you have a plan before you find yourself in crisis. And while you can't plan for every possible scenario, I think having guidelines, having practices, having strategies about how your organization is going to approach a crisis or a disaster is very important. And the first for a lot of nonprofits is admitting to ourselves that difficult times are inevitable. Mistakes happen, accidents do occur, and people and equipment and products and technology can mess up. And so I find sometimes nonprofits can be in denial that that'll never happen to us, or that's not something we ever have to worry about. And that's just simply not true. And as leaders, it's important that we have a plan. And so the unexpected often does happen. And so don't be in denial about it if you can. So at a minimum, your plan really needs to have an idea of who's going to take the lead during a crisis, who will be the spokesperson that you're going to put in front of a microphone or a staff meeting, whether that's an internal audience or an external audience, and make sure you have those people in particular trained, whether it's media training or crisis communication training, or just in conversation with leadership who are going to work with your organization as you move through a crisis situation. And you should revisit that crisis communication plan on a semi-annual or an annual basis, just to make sure that the names are correct, you've updated it for staffing changes, and that people in leadership are aware that a plan is in place. The second guideline is do not lie. In a crisis, you may not be able to tell everything. You may not be able to share all the details, whether you're dealing with a personnel matter, a supervisory situation, or an ongoing investigation, or maybe even victims' rights are involved, and you can't tell everything. But you should never communicate lies. And it might seem surprising that we actually have to say that out loud, do not lie. But often during an organizational catastrophe or a social disaster, people panic. And we know during a crisis, science tells us that our composure, it gets frayed, and people oftentimes can have an urge to soothe or to assure people that all will be well. And sometimes that means that we might lie or create falsehoods, or said in a more generous way, we might tell people what they want to hear. And I think that a lot of these situations can be done with good intentions, but at the end of the day, it will make the situation worse. So prevent further harm, do not lie. The third is make sure you have the right people on the field. Competencies during crisis are different than when things are going well in the organization. And your communications team or your leadership team responsible for working with your organization through a difficult time needs to be honest about who is best to lead and communicate when things aren't going well. And that may not always be the head of the organization. And this is sometimes hard for us to admit, but I think several of us have probably seen leaders who don't handle intense moments very well. You may know heads of organizations that can often appear defensive or even aggressive when anxiety is running high. And those may not be the best individuals to put in front of a microphone or in front of the staff meeting. So make sure you get the right folks in the right positions, even if it's a temporary role during seasons of difficult times. The fourth communication principle is to lead with care. It's really important that we acknowledge loss and mistakes or missteps by demonstrating that as an organization or as a leader, you don't have your head in the sand, and realize that there are oftentimes multiple audiences, and your communication strategy and approach might differ for those different audiences. You may need to care for those audiences in different ways. We often, just as a reminder, fail to address our internal communication or internal employees during a crisis. We kind of assume our staff is on board with everything. And so it's really important that you don't leave out employees, internal staff, or unpaid volunteers. Make sure that you're checking in with them and that you're caring for them during a time of crisis as well. Our next principle is to, I think I skipped, sorry. I jump ahead? Yeah, know when and how to apologize. Often when things go wrong, an apology is in order. And we have probably all seen examples of really bad apologies. And there is a better way to apologize. For example, saying I made a mistake is far more effective than saying mistakes were made. Right? There are examples of people who have done this very well. And I might share one of those in the chat. I'll give you an example of an organization that I think has handled this pretty well, as best as you possibly can. But know when and how to apologize. Our next one is to provide clear and honest frequent communication. Effective crisis communication is all of those things. It does not over reassure people, but frequent communication can reduce rumors. It can make sure that we're kind of quelling any anxiety and fear. People may not like the answers that you have, but they'll appreciate knowing what the organization is doing in response to a crisis. Next is to reach out and ask for help. You don't have to know how to do it all. And as nonprofits, most of us are nonprofits on this call, you may have limited resources or staff or expertise in this area. So please be assured that you don't have to weather this alone. There are people whose entire career is based on helping organizations walk through tough times. And so part of being responsive and not reactive is having a plan in which you know who the people you're going to reach out to in times that are difficult, who those people will be. Develop a circle of trust as critical communication partners who are the wise people in your circle, your HR department, legal consultants like the lawyers that we have on this particular call, communication partners who can help walk alongside you through difficult times. For nonprofit and religious organizations, that might be your judicatory organization or your parachurch bodies or even super agencies like United Way, who might be able to come alongside you and walk with you through a crisis. But the other thing that I want to encourage all of us on this call to do, it's really important that you are developing relationships with colleagues across your sector and even beyond it so that you can learn from their experiences and their wisdom when things go wrong. And so consider asking some of those people to serve in a capacity that can be a sounding board for you in the event of a crisis. I know in our organization, when the Michael Brown shooting happened in Ferguson, we pulled together a group of professionals from our laity and our congregations who were experts in crisis communication and social work, who could come alongside our local church in Ferguson to help them during that season so that they could best address their community's needs. So you don't have to have it all within your own house, right? You can reach out and ask for help. Number 8, share clear, practical, and committed actions. I want to encourage us to be patient about offering actions that your organization will do in the wake of a disaster because of our principle of do not lie. Make sure that you're not just offering kind of quick fixes. And don't forget that when you introduce actions your organization is going to take, don't say you're going to do something if you're not going to do it, or if the organization isn't fully committed behind it. So that might mean you are slower to share those things that you're going to do, but make sure that you can commit to the things that you're going to say. And if you don't have commitments or actions to take, share a timeline of when you anticipate those things will be able to take place. And our last one is always be learning. One of my favorite movies is Glengarry Glen Ross, and the actor Alec Baldwin is a sales manager, and he's brought into the local sales team to help motivate them. And one of his tough love pieces of advice is always be closing. It's a reminder that the salesperson is never off the clock. And so for our purposes, I want us to always be learning. When a crisis is over, ask yourself, what could we have done better? How can we learn from this? And this is where your circle of trust can be helpful for you. So post-crisis, gather those advisors together, gather people from both your internal and external audience, and ask, how can we learn from this experience? And how can we weather the next difficult time? the best way possible. So those are just some standard principles I try to keep in mind as I help to lead our organization through the various seasons of life. And hopefully they may be helpful to you as you prepare and become a responsive organization versus a reactive one.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. Not enough clergy quote Glengarry Glen Ross from the pulpit. I hope that you will change that. So we will shift now from the communication side of things to the legal side of things. And I'm excited to hear some lessons learned from Husch's own Scott Schneider. Scott?
I think I have more gray hair now than I did in that picture, which isn't that long ago. So I've aged a lot. When Jordan asked me to participate in this webinar, I was thinking about my experiences in dealing with situations that involve, crises. And I've had a couple of perspectives. I mean, I've been in-house where in a nonprofit organization where we would have a series of crises and thoughts about how we manage those. And then at Husch and even before Husch, I've been involved in from an outside perspective a whole host of high profile crises, but very difficult situations, and running the gamut from, legacy sex abuse to data reporting scandals and widespread, racial discrimination and things like that. And one of the things when Jordan asked me was, I was just like, what are sort of the lessons learned in terms of how an institution, nonprofit institution, leaders should approach those. And I don't know if this is super legal or not, but these are just some general thoughts from, being in the trenches on these sorts of things. And I'll try to keep it, I know we've got a lot of material to cover, really short and sweet. The first thing is, if you become aware of an incident, and I think typically where I'm seeing this more and more often is like there's a Facebook post or an email is sent out of the blue, or for some reason you become aware of an internal issue, and you're the leader of the organization. The first sort of thing I've learned or lesson I've learned is it's important for leaders to know who do I need to involve, and I do think, depending on the seriousness of the issue, the sensitivities involved, it's maybe keeping that circle as small as possible to protect, confidentiality. I do, again, a lot of sex abuse related work, but knowing who in the institution, board members or an executive committee of the board needs to know. And absolutely at all costs, avoiding the temptation to minimize the seriousness of the situation. And there's a difference between, everything is the biggest deal in the world, and so people start tuning you out. I mean, there are probably in the course of your career as the leader of a nonprofit organization, probably one or two of these sorts of situations that come up. Maybe over the course of the career, but knowing, hey, when you have one of those, one of the big errors I see is the initial sort of, this isn't really a big deal. And some of that is psychological. I don't want people to start second guessing me, but not doing that, avoiding that temptation. The second is, and again, even when I was inside of a nonprofit, and I can't talk about specifics, but what I'm being bombarded with information, competing information, or scant information, or ambiguous information. What I want is for someone to come in here, turn over the rocks, go through the files, meet with people, and tell me what's going on. Someone who's an independent voice, who's willing to, call balls and strikes, and has the courage to tell me the truth. And again, I've worked inside a nonprofit where I've retained those sorts of people, and what they tell me, I go, that's not what I wanted to hear, but that's exactly the sort of person you want or group you want. Somebody that's thorough, willing to tell you the truth, even if it's really bad, but that also has sort of the experience and expertise to capture nuance. Again, same thing that I was mentioning on the first point. Someone that could tell me, yeah, no, this is serious, but it can give me context and nuance. Someone who's been through one of these before. But independence is super important. Someone who's willing to tell me things that maybe make for tough listening. I will say this: if you do that, you retain this independent person or group to basically explore what you've become aware of. I always tell people, in terms of how we respond institutionally, that leadership has to manage their expectations appropriately. I am an enormous, I won't go into my therapy details, but one of the things I realize is that, hey, I have these people-pleasing tendencies. And I think a lot of folks, especially in the nonprofit world, leaders in the nonprofit world, are people pleasers and want to come up with a response to something that makes everyone happy. And I can tell you, a lot of almost every, scandal or very difficult situation I've been involved in, even when I thought the institution was handling the matter appropriately and with care and with wisdom, there's always going to be a contingent, especially now, where we're operating in a culture where there is an inordinate amount of distrust for institutional decision making. And so even when you're doing the best you can and doing the right thing and making difficult decisions, know that you're going to have criticism. And so in these, I just think right up front, managing expectations appropriately. If you think we're going to develop a path that's going to make everybody happy, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. When we confirm problems through an independent review or some sort of independent consideration of what was going on, I think it's important for leaders to confer with internal, diverse institutional stakeholders. Hey, this is the information we have, and you can figure that out, and it varies depending on the circumstances. And then come up, number one, with a game plan to remedy harm, and this is sort of the next point. And then I almost think more importantly, ensure that whatever has happened doesn't happen again. And in making those sorts of calls about remedying harm or apologizing, I love that conversation, that all of our steps are taken and our game plan, our path moving forward is done in a manner that is consistent with certainly the truth, but our institutional values, our professed values about, and nonprofits have wonderful mission statements in that regard, but that's what guides us. Again, not making everybody happy or making the thing go away, but living and doing things that are in alignment with our institutional values. Number 5, there used to be a time, so how do I put this? There used to be a time, maybe 20, 30 years ago, where there was a formulaic PR statement that would come out. And you all have seen some version of this in a variety of different contexts. It's 2 or 3 sentences. It's very, we're committed to this, that, and the other thing, and not much of any substances is communicated. And, when there was more, and this is probably 30, years ago, 40 years ago, more widespread trust of institutions, that sort of approach may have worked. It doesn't work anymore. When we have confirmed serious issues a kind of one-off, 4 or 5 sentence press release is not going to cut it. And at least in my experience, is likely going to inflame the situation and make the crisis continue to go on. And so 5 is, and this is difficult, and I've been put in these situations a lot, and I know I've worked with leaders who've been in these situations a lot, but I think the best path is to engage substantively with your community about what you have learned, what you are prepared to do to address the situation going backwards and going forwards. And let me tell you, if I have, gray hair, and I have a lot more now than I did before, it's, from doing that work, and people are passionate, and, lots of tears. I've cried at many of these, but I think that's super, super important. A one-off sort of, press release, I don't think typically is going to cut it. Engage substantively with the community. And along those lines, meaningfully acknowledge and commit to remedy the past harm as best as possible. And sometimes I will say, lawyers maybe make that more difficult than it needs to be. And this is the most important part of it. Again, this is a value proposition. It also happens to be a good risk mitigation. I'll put my lawyer hat on for a second. I think the most important thing following a confirmed incident of some crisis is, how do we make sure that whatever we're going through never, ever, ever happens again? And that to me is the most important part of any sort of nonprofit response to one of these things. And I do think it's important in coming up with a game plan that we engage appropriately credentialed professionals. Some of them are lawyers, a lot of them aren't, depending on the circumstances. But once we find out there's a problem and it's serious and we've engaged with our community, the moral obligation, in my mind, is to absolutely commit to a thoughtful plan to make sure that whatever we've uncovered never happens again. 7 and 5 are sort of connected. Try to err on the side of transparency. So one of the questions we get a lot is, if you do that independent investigation, should you disclose the results of that to the broader community? And no, there's risks, some of them legal, some of them moral, some of them about a willingness to participate in a process that's going to be that transparent, et cetera. Those are complicated questions. I think in general, when I have seen organizations manage crises well, they seem to err on the side of transparency. And as I said earlier, meaningful engagement. And then this last piece, accountability. We are in, I think, a culture, and this goes back. There's great philosophical books about the roles of sacrificial lambs in our society. There's great French philosophy books on this. If you're looking for something to read, I can make some book recommendations. I hate the idea of offering people up as sacrificial lambs, especially people on the low end of the totem pole. If there is, we do a review of a situation and we confirm, wow, there was a serious mishandling of something. I don't think we willy-nilly just go. I feel almost a moral obligation to treat everybody fairly and not to just needlessly throw somebody under the bus, to mollify folks. Certainly, if there was any sort of leadership failure, boards and leaders of organizations, accountability is sometimes people lose their jobs over that. So it's complicated, but yeah, I think there has to be meaningful accountability. And then the last piece of this is what I try to tell people, no matter how serious, significant the crisis is that we're dealing with, know that at some point it ends. These don't go on perpetually. And one of the weird things, and whether it's a good development or a bad development about kind of the social media age that we're in, is that cycle of crisis feels like it gets shorter and shorter with time. You can go on Twitter one day and people are up in arms about something, and then 2 days later they found something else. They've moved on, and so know that when we start this, at some point it's going to come to an end. And overall, when it's over, do we have a sense that we were thorough, that we were fair with people internally, that we handled people who were harmed, that we have tried our best to remedy that harm, and that most importantly, are we comfortable that we've developed a plan, a thoughtful plan to make sure that whatever happened doesn't happen again? So those were the sort of 8 things when I thought about this webinar that jumped to mind.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, especially hearing from somebody who's been in the trenches so often. Your guidance is very, very much appreciated. I'm going to speed pretty quickly through my section, partly because I think the conversation that we have planned will hopefully be very valuable. I was going to speak briefly about a different kind of concern, which is financial distress. And unfortunately, we've seen an uptick in that from nonprofit clients over the last 2 years. Some are seeing a huge influx of giving during the pandemic. Others have seen that giving moving elsewhere. So unfortunately, this has become a reality for a number of nonprofits. What I was going to talk about briefly was fiduciary duties that directors owe. And even if you're not a director, I think this is important because generally directors of tax-exempt organizations owe certain duties to the organization, to its members, to the other directors. But there comes a point when that expands a bit, and those fiduciary duties are also owed to creditors of the organization. So I won't go into all the background. I assume most people have at least a general familiarity with what fiduciary duties are, with understanding that directors act pursuant to the business judgment rule, that they are acting in an informed basis, in good faith, that they honor the duty of care and loyalty and obedience, that they're avoiding engaging in interested transactions, and they're acting within legal constraints. What we've seen, however, is when tax-exempt organizations, or indeed any organizations, approach insolvency, there's this expansion of those duties that extends to creditors of the organization. That doesn't mean that it solely extends to creditors. Directors still have to make decisions based on the best interests of the organizations they represent. But there's been a lot of litigation recently about when that switch is flipped. I'm a fan of the US version of The Office. And one of the best scenes is when Michael Scott walks out of his office and he just screams, "I declare bankruptcy," which is not really how it happens. So courts have created this idea, this very ominous sounding idea called the zone of insolvency. And unfortunately, we've had to talk through this with clients more and more. But essentially what it means is it's a period when a corporation is in financial distress, but not quite insolvent, but they're getting there. And the question is, well, at one point, do directors start to extend fiduciary duties to creditors? Generally, there's 2 tests that are both really simple. The equity test, when can you stop paying your bills? And the balance sheet test, when do your total liabilities exceed your total assets? But obviously those are really simplistic, and there are certain business realities. If anyone has ever served as a trustee of a church and you look at the finances in September and October, you're scared to death because it looks like you're never going to meet your year-end goals. And then every year, come Advent or December, there's a huge influx of giving. That's a business reality. There are kind of ebbs and flows, and courts will take that into account. If you are feeling that financial distress, or in the future if you feel it, here's a few things that you ought to consider to determine whether you're there. Obviously the tests that we talked about, but you need to work with those that have the financial acumen in your organization. Your CFO, your treasurer, a finance committee. And if not, you may need to retain a competent third party to do a viability study, a financial viability study, or offer some guidance. If you're in a precarious situation financially, it's incumbent upon directors and executive directors and staff members to carefully monitor assets and liabilities and expenses and determine whether, for example, there's any development gifts in the pipeline that may impact that situation. If you find yourself in that situation, what should you do? Obviously, work with your committee, your staff, your consultants to determine your financial health, weigh those costs and benefits. You can still invest in the organization, but be aware of decisions that may have a small benefit to the organization, but a huge risk to creditors. That's what sets off red flags if those situations or decisions are questioned later on. Be well informed. This is the biggest advice that I can give. Every group has those two directors that in every meeting want to spend half an hour talking about why postage expenditures are 2% over budget, and then nobody else reviews the financial statements until the day of the meeting. If you find yourself in one of these situations, it's incumbent upon board presidents, executive directors, CFOs to make sure that directors are aware of the situation, that they have what they need, and that they are encouraged to be up to speed on these issues. What should you not do? Don't deviate from sound practices. Until you know what's in front of you, don't cut staff, don't cut programs. Figure out where you are and what things look like in the future first. Don't engage in fraudulent conveyances or self-dealing. Don't give one class of creditors preference over another. Pretty simple things. The last thing here, again, sounds ominous, but it's important. For directors, don't resign from the board under the belief that it will provide complete protection. You may still have liability for pre-resignation acts and omissions. And again, I don't mean for that to sound ominous, but what we see happening is when that email goes out from the finance director to say, hey, we're in trouble, sometimes directors up and leave. And they don't want any personal liability. They want to distance themselves from the situation. And typically that's the last thing the organization needs. For directors that are committed to the mission, who have that institutional knowledge, to pick up and leave. Obviously, there's really nothing you can do to stop that from happening, but hopefully executive directors and others can at least push directors to see it through, to stay involved in that process. That's what I've got. What I'd like to do now, I don't see any questions coming in, but what the three of us had discussed was taking some time to go through some hypotheticals. I came up with some situations. These are all made up or made up-ish. Some have to do with some examples that I've seen or colleagues have seen. What I'd like to do is just throw that out there for a conversation. Like I said, if anyone has questions or a hypothetical, feel free to put them in the question box. I know there are some other Husch Blackwell attorneys on here. If you want to chime in, put that in the question box as well, and we'll bring you into the loop. So what I'd like to do is start out with our first hypothetical and talk about if you find yourself in this situation, what you might want to do. So here, a history of abuse. You recently joined the board of a nonprofit that operates overnight camps for youth outside of a major city. Shortly after joining the board, you get a letter sent to your home from an author that claims to have been sexually abused by a counselor at the camp as a teenager over 20 years ago. The author claims there are other victims of abuse that have reached out to the camp staff in the past and believe that their claims have been covered up. As a new director, you get this in the mail. You don't know whether anyone else has received these claims. You don't know whether the organization has looked into these allegations in the past. Not an easy place to start, but Scott, Kim, I'll throw it out. Any suggestions that you might have?
Yeah, so this is, I've alluded to this. I mean, the legacy abuse cases. One of the things I've learned, one of the great things about the Me Too movement in general was creating a path that destigmatized coming forward with allegations of sex discrimination and sex assault. So you go back, 30, 40 years ago, and even not that long ago, what you find is there was a lot of, obviously, sex abuse going on that was in part perpetuated because to come forward, there was an enormous stigma associated with that. And so I've been involved in a lot of these. They're enormously challenging, emotionally difficult to navigate through. And look, I think it's fair to say that different nonprofits have had different approaches to these. I think in this one, if I'm on a board and I get any sort of message like this, I'm obviously taking that message up the leadership chain, who runs the board, maybe the executive director, and say, wow, this seems serious. It screams to me we probably need to look into this. At the very least, one of the things that we're concerned about here is this camp counselor, does he continue to work or she continue to work with us? Do they work in any sort of capacity where they have ongoing interactions with vulnerable communities and minors? So, there may not be much we can do to remedy something that happened 20 or 30 years ago. In a lot of these cases, that's what we're dealing with. But like one ethical, legal, moral reason that we do some sort of intervention is to at least see, hey, is this person even, do they have access to people in the vulnerable population? Again, and then what makes it a little bit complicated in terms of how much do we communicate and all that sort of stuff is there is a corresponding, concerns about the reputation of the person who has been accused. So exercising, we have this report, we're not, jumping to any conclusions. But it sort of screams for, as I said earlier on, some sort of independent review, some sort of due diligence into the report, and elevating that to the appropriate people within the nonprofit organization.
Jordan, one of the things that came to mind when I read this case study was, again, about being responsive, is when you do onboarding for directors, or even for any kind of senior leadership team, right? Like making sure they're aware of the process should something like this happen, right? Because I think sometimes mistakes are made in the response by people, again, good intentions, but they don't know the proper protocols for how to report up, as Scott was saying, and they don't know what the next step is, or they think, oh, somebody else maybe got this letter, it's not my problem, they throw it away, right? Like, what is the process? And so that can be part of an onboarding process that happens for boards of a nonprofit or senior leadership team. And what's the difference between a board's responsibility and staff's responsibility should something like this come to light?
Yeah, I will add, I got 2 comments from Ed Barker, who is one of our colleagues, 2 very, very good comments. One of which is know whether there is a duty, whether you have an obligation to hotline this, to call law enforcement. And I will say probably about 2/3 of those on the call right now are in education or healthcare or religious organizations. So make sure you understand what your state laws are if there is an obligation. And Ed also followed up and says, if you're on the board, call the chair of the board who has more background and follow up to be assured it's investigated. And I want to focus on one word that Ed used there that I think is critical, and that word is call. I sometimes get laughed at by nonprofit clients when I tell them again and again and again, don't put anything in email that you wouldn't want to be Exhibit A shown in front of a jury. And everybody says, well, of course that's the way it is. And then everybody does it anyway. And because it's instantaneous and you see something like this and there's urgency and there's panic and you want to reach out. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that anyone is putting things in emails that are inappropriate, that are necessarily wrong or immoral or illegal. But as Scott was saying, the fact of the matter is things change as you proceed through the investigation. And what happens a lot of times is there's an email that goes out that may call into question certain things or may raise certain issues that in hindsight may look kind of silly or may look wrong. So you don't avoid emails, avoid voicemails, avoid text messages. have conversations, have face-to-face meetings if you're in person. It's a great way to handle it. We have another comment that basically says, raises the issue about the differences between the roles of boards versus senior leadership teams when responding to challenging situations. It's a really good point. And I will say it's difficult kind of in the religious world because it's very different, the pastor versus leadership boards versus in higher education or K-12 schools or healthcare. There's all these questions about who does what. So it's hard to give a firm answer. That should be a conversation, though, that takes place immediately, just so the left hand knows what the right is doing. What you don't want to have happen, and I see this in historical documents, the board thinks leadership is taking care of it and vice versa.
Yeah, I want to maybe synthesize a couple of themes. Ed's point is spot on. One of the things that we've seen, and this has been a phenomenon in the last 20 years, and again, I work primarily with educational institutions, is mandatory reporting obligations. Some of which, depending on the state, all of which are very state specific. Some of which, there are interesting questions about in these sort of legacy cases, does it trigger all very state specific requirements? But some of those requirements do explicitly extend to board members. And it's not unheard of. And even I'm in Texas, we've seen this lately. For board members or, coaches or whatever who had a report sort of like this, didn't make that mandatory report and end up, with the police coming and all of that. So number one, Ed's point is a good one. To Kim's point, yes, the onboarding of board members, to the extent there is that sort of legal obligation, do they know about it? So that they can proceed accordingly. I mean, there's a really interesting conversation to be had about, we had all these mandatory reporting requirements. Well, what happens, once the report is made? And at least in my experience, a lot of these things just go into a black hole. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a really important point.
We got a great comment that the E in email stands for evil, eternal, and evidentiary, which I've never heard before, but is spot on. Well, thank you, Scott and Kim, for that. We won't get to all of these, but I want to pick some of them that I think may result in some interesting discussion. So this one, you are an employee working in the president's office of a public university. Your university hosts an annual college for kids in which middle and high school students live in the residence halls for a week and take introductory classes. I was an RA. I know I'd get my hand slapped if I called them dorms rather than residence halls. But you get a call from an angry parent who claims that their son sent pictures of counselors drinking with underage students. The parent threatens to post the picture on the university's social media page unless they can talk to the president immediately. What do you do?
With that, so I've had this actually much worse. The kind of the threatening email to a university president or the head of an independent school about, hey, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, I'm going public and I'll go to the newspaper or I'll post it and all that kind of stuff. And I think it was about 2 years ago, I saw, and this I wasn't even privy to the communication. The president's sort of stock response was something along the lines of, in any sort of situation like this where, and I'll paraphrase what he said in this context, hey, I'm happy to meet with you. I do want to be clear, in any sort of situation like this, I encourage the people, if you want to go to the public, that you should go public with this. That's not why I'm meeting with you, to avoid the threat of media exposure and all that. By all means, I go public with it if you think it's that important, but I'm happy to meet with you. And this seems, again, one of the, there's so much maybe to like about social media, so much to dislike, but yeah, everybody has a bit of a public platform. And so we get threats like this all the time. Again, at least for like really sophisticated, like university president, independent school heads. When I've seen it done well, it's, by all means, move forward. Go, if you want to post this, have at it. But and if it warrants a meeting, happy to meet with you. I don't know, Kim, if you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think sometimes we can kind of overreact and start to get into negotiations, right, to try to take down the threat. And I would agree, Scott. I think that maybe the healthier approach is to, first not minimize the concern of the parent if you're actually, on a call with them, right? Like that's important. But to not get into this, what can we give you in order for you not to, go forward? An example of a organization that I thought was going through a kind of a scandal. They said, the phrase that they said is, are you willing to tell the truth about your organization, even if it's embarrassing to us? And I think going back to kind of what your institutional values are, I think you have to be okay with people putting stuff out there. And if that's the way a resolution, a healthier way of being in community together takes place, then go for it. But I also think we know that there are some presidents of organizations that you would love to have in front of parents. And then there are others that somebody else might be more appropriate for that conversation. And so I think I like that president's approach to invitation of being, I'd love to sit down and talk to you.
It also undercuts what we've seen from jury research, not necessarily related to this, but when an organization does something right because it's kind of a threat or blackmail or whatever posed against them, there's a tendency to think that they're doing it for the wrong reason. So Scott, I love that response. We did get a question as far as reporting requirements and whether it would depend on the current age of the alleged victim. That is true. In some states, it's whether the identity of the abuser is known. Because it varies from state to state, I don't want to share too much here. What I will tell you that I have done for clients in the past when there are questions, they have asked me to call the state hotline and provide a hypothetical without identifying them, basically saying, hey, here's what we have. Here's the age of this person that they allege something happened 30 years ago. We don't know who the abuser is, on and on and on. And sometimes they will say, yes, you need to hotline that. And sometimes they will say, no, there's nothing we can do with that. So it provides, if your nonprofit is unsure whether to make that call, generally what I found is the state hotlines are willing to have that discussion and provide some guidance. They're probably not going to put it in writing, but it might provide you with at least a little bit of, again, help you sleep better at night.
Yeah, and I always say, and I don't want to give legal advice. What you said was spot on. It's very state specific. And whenever I'm in doubt, I just go make the report. Let's just make the report.
When in doubt, make the call.
Yep. I'm going to move ahead to this one called Number One Facebook Fan, because this happens for whatever reason. It's exploded in the last few months. So imagine you are the director of communications for a large nonprofit. You oversee all the social media accounts. In response to a recent post on Facebook, a former volunteer commented and claimed your CEO made inappropriate statements at a golf tournament fundraiser. Fill in the blank as to what it is. One of your staff members deletes the comment, and since that time, this individual has repeated the accusation in comments to your Facebook, your Twitter, your Instagram, TikTok, MySpace, fill in the blanks. Kim, you probably deal with more of this than anyone else. Scott, you've raised the issue as well. This just seems to come up again and again. Kim, do you have any guidance for this director of communications?
Yeah, well, one, I think for this particular audience, we need to strengthen our ability to handle kind of criticism in this particular sphere, right? And be okay with it. The idea that like no one's ever going to be upset with your organization it's just not a reality. I will revisit kind of planning. I think it's really important that your staff who's responsible for social media know what your protocols are regarding this type of situation and whether or not we delete comments or not. I'm my organization, we err on not deleting things because I think there's just, opportunities for that to get out of control. And so my staff knows how we deal with criticism or with accusations. And I think that taking a page from our last case study of inviting, you can always invite a social media user. We'd be happy to be in conversation with you about this. Sometimes you're going to find out you'll never hear from those people again because that's not what they were wanting. They weren't wanting an actual conversation. But responding to somebody's comment of like, we'd love to learn more about this experience that you had, but not necessarily deleting comments because it looks like you're trying to cover something up. And so I think increasing your tolerance for things to get a little hot in social media, but again, you can actually fan the flames and make things worse if you kind of respond too quickly to something like this.
Yeah, Kim, what you said, oh man, it was just like, I think I was applauding behind the scenes. I was very happy. Look, I think the hypothetical, there's all right, hey, maybe this triggers probably some sort of obligation to look into the allegation, right? So that's legit. And I don't have an issue with that. The number of calls I get from folks who say something along the lines of, this is going viral on social media and we need to do something. And it's like, you could tell they're over caffeinated or whatever the case might be. And you kind of dig a little bit, like, well, what do you mean it's going viral? It's like somebody posted something and it has 37 likes. And I'm like, okay, I'm with you 100%. I mean, some degree of like stoicism about what goes on. Yeah. If you ever spend any time on Twitter, it's like a cesspool. And undoubtedly, I mean, there's going to be negative things about an organization and you just have to have a thicker skin. Now, look, I mean, there's a difference between, kind of that, again, let's investigate what was said, but we don't have to overreact to something that is kind of a minor blip in social media. It seems to be, at least in my experience, ultimately really counterproductive and it makes what is a non-story potentially a story that goes on a little longer. So I couldn't agree more with you, Kim.
Clients hate hearing that, but just ignore it. Seems to be the best advice for my.
In some cases.
Yeah. We've got about 2 minutes left. I'm going to hit this one just because there's some guidance that I want to share. A whistleblower. You're the superintendent of a K-12 district. An employee under the vice president of finance was fired, asked for a meeting, you refuse, and then they send you an email claiming they found evidence that certain staff members have been using public funds for personal reasons. When they shared that with their boss, they were fired. They have retained an attorney and demand a meeting, or they will file a lawsuit. One thing I want to point out at the outset here, because this has come up a few times in my work with nonprofits, and that's the key. They have retained an attorney, and they will file a lawsuit. Typically, what I have done in situations like that in guiding a nonprofit is tell them, it's one thing if you have your own legal counsel. If you're a smaller nonprofit and you don't, have your attorney reach out and to say, you have retained counsel and threatened a lawsuit. Please reach out to me as counsel for the organization, or have your attorney reach out to me. What I have found is in probably 80% of the cases in which I've sent that letter, we never hear anything again. And that may be the right guidance sometimes, the wrong guidance other times, but I have found it to be fairly effective. Scott, Kim, we got about a minute left. I don't want to keep people over, but if there's anything else that you want to add to this. All right. Well, let me do two things. First of all, say thank you to Scott and to Kim, to Morgan from the firm that helped set all this up. I'm seeing some comments asking if we could do this again and focus on the other hypothetical. So who knows? Maybe we'll take this on the road. I do want to say to everyone that joined, I see a lot of familiar faces and names, firm clients and other people in our world. So thank you for joining us today. We hope this information was helpful, didn't scare you too much, and you're left with some information. The program has been approved for legal education hours. Click on the CEU icon. You'll get a recording and a certificate of attendance. Again, if you can take a few minutes to fill out the survey, we would appreciate it. And finally, if you're in Missouri or Kansas or a few other states, don't forget to vote today. Thank you, everyone, for all of your time and the great questions. If you have any others, feel free to reach out, and hope you have a great day.